Welcome guys, thank you so much for clicking on my channel. This is part 3 of my video reviewing Andrew Morton's book The Queen. Now I'm only looking at particular chapters, so this chapter is about Princess Diana's death and the royal family's reaction to it, so please do go and check out my other videos if you are interested in part 1 and part 2. This is obviously part 3, as I've said, so please do go check out the rest of the book if you are interested. But as I said, here I'm just covering this chapter on Princess Diana's death. And so please do subscribe also to my channel and press the bell button so that you're notified of all my other videos. So where we are at the moment is that Princess Diana obviously has died. The Queen has come from Balmoral and has come to London, and we're about to hear her televised speech. So I will begin. Meanwhile, Her Majesty was preparing for only the second televised address of her reign. The first was in late February 1991 as Allied troops were preparing to join the First Gulf War. And I guess this doesn't include her Christmas speeches, obviously. So she knew it was something she should do, noted one senior advisor. Her speech was initially drafted by her private secretary, then discussed with the Queen, Prince Philip and other courtiers before being sent to Downing Street for final approval. As Blair and Campbell read the draft, one of the duo suggested that the sovereign should speak not only as the Queen, but also as a grandmother. It was a touch of genius. And I agree, I remember that speech, and it was very poignant that she spoke as a grandmother, because for me, that was like the first time I was like, oh my God, the Queen as a grandmother? She agreed to be filmed live in the Chinese room in the front of a large window overlooking the Mall, which was teeming with flowers and mourners. Now, if you remember that speech, obviously the Queen was filmed beside the window, and obviously you could see outside the window, and I think there are some photos of her from, like, being filmed from the crowd, so you could see from the window, I think. And if you remember her giving the speech, to me personally, you could see the tears in her eyes. You could see that she was trying to control her emotions and deliver this very difficult speech. It was very hard for her to get out. And I think it was really unfair that she was portrayed as this sort of cold person, and that they were portrayed as this wicked, cold family that sort of hated her and drove her out and treated her so badly. And I don't think it was accurately reflected in the film The Queen when she gave the speech. Because I think, in my view, you can see how teary-eyed she was, and it was difficult for her. It was a very difficult time for her. The speech, which lasted 3 minutes and 9 seconds, honestly, it felt so much longer than that. And it was so monumental, yet it was only 3 minutes and 9 seconds. Gosh, what people can do with the power of words. It was one of the most effective of her reign. Her uncomplicated authenticity, clear reading and respect shown towards the late princess meant there was an immediate dissipation of the hostility to the Windsors. She spoke of disbelief, incomprehension, and sense of loss. We have all felt those emotions in those last few days, so what I say to you now as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being, in good times and in bad. She never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admire and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her boys. I mean, what beautiful, beautiful words, and what a good tribute. With a nod to the criticism of herself and her family, she continued, I, for one, believe that there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. So I think the Queen's words were very beautiful. And I think, she really did love Diana. And I thought that this was a very difficult time for her, and I don't think she gets enough credit for it. She had been slow to change direction when it came clear that she was out of step with the nation, and although the boys were the focus of the family and her own concerns, there had been nothing to stop a camera crew from filming a similar message at Balmoral several days earlier. This would have stopped the criticism of the royal family and the monarchy in its tracks. Now, let's pause for a moment there, because I can't remember what it was like in 1997. I mean, I do remember the negativity towards the royal family after Princess Diana's death. But Nowadays, obviously, it's so savage. You know, everyone nowadays is so quick to criticize those in privilege, those that have money, those who are rich, aristocracy. Everyone is so quick to criticize them, and you know, as though they don't bleed like we bleed. And people are so quick to criticize the royal family, and people, you know, social media is just one massive, you know, beast of its own. And in 1997, I don't necessarily believe that if the Queen had reacted quickly and done a speech in Balmoral, that people wouldn't have criticised her, because people always want to criticise and people will always find a way to criticise. And I think that we're moving towards the needs of the public rather than the needs of this family and the needs of this boy, and grieving their mother and their daughter-in-law and their auntie and their, you know, friend and their ex-wife. And, you know, we're delving into the, why wasn't she there for the public? Why wasn't she there for the public? The public are grieving, the public are mourning. Okay, you know, give her a couple of days. And I think if she did a speech in Balmoral, I think, one, we don't know what her emotional state was, and two, there was so many things going on. If you watch my video number 1 and my video number 2, there was so many discussions and meetings and calls, and with courtiers and officials and the parliament and, you know, the government, sorry, and there was a lot going on. It was very fast, and I don't know if they had time. I don't know if anyone suggested she should do a televised address in Balmoral, and I think that people would have been like, oh, look at you in Balmoral, still on holiday. You can't even be bothered to make your way down, like to stop your holiday early and come all the way down to Buckingham Palace, because people just have this perception that she was out on holiday, when, you know, obviously all this had happened and what she was trying to do was isolate her boys. So, yeah, I don't think that this necessarily would have stopped all the criticism, but okay. Her speech, though several days late, had done the trick. Archbishop Carey remarked that it showed her compassion and understanding. It went a long way towards silencing her critics and removing the misunderstanding that had developed. Now, I don't think it did remove the misunderstanding, because, as I said, I think a lot of people's perception was, oh, look at this cold person. She's not even showing emotion. She's just reading something, obviously because it was so emotionally difficult for her. And, oh, she's just doing it, now it's a bit late, blah, blah, blah. But I think that there was a lot of criticism of her. And if you watch my video number 2, quite surprisingly, a lot of that criticism was sort of staged, and it was really, really unfair, because she gets a lot of criticisms for things that she wasn't agreeing with, and that it wasn't even true. So things like not allowing Charles to use a plane to get Diana to go and see Diana, or to get Diana's body. I mean, or her not agreeing to her being her body laying at Royal Chapel. I mean, it was all such nonsense. So she was agreeing to things right from the beginning. So I think it was really, really unfair that she lives with that criticism. And I don't believe that when she gave this speech that a lot of the narrative was corrected. I think that the criticism of the royal family still continued. And to this day, I think the Queen has been criticised so much, really, really unfairly. At dinner on Friday evening, one final question needed to be answered. Would William and Harry walk behind their mother's coffin and follow royal tradition, while the final decision was left to the princes themselves? In the end, it was the intervention of their grandfather, Prince Philip, that proved decisive. If I walk, will you walk with me? He asked. When William agreed, Harry followed his lead. The boys are very close with their grandparents, adore them, observed Press Secretary Dickie Arbiter. Significantly, they walked for their grandfather, not their father or uncle. There was also the fear that if only Prince Charles and Charles Spencer appeared on foot behind the coffin, the future king, who had received numerous threatening letters during the week, could be jeered at or physically attacked by one of the members of the crowd who blamed the prince for Diana's death. Now, can you imagine how dangerous that would have been for him, for Prince Charles, as he then was, walking behind her coffin? What a security risk that was, and he still did it, and how fearful he must have been. And there's a sense of shame, but he still did it. And in a sense, he did it for her, and he did it for the boys. And so Prince Harry, Meghan Markle's not the only one to have had threats, okay? And I think his threats were probably very, very real because of how much people loved Princess Diana and how angry they were at that time. But he still fulfilled his duty, and he is still the king now of England. So he stuck to his duty, despite those threats. Now, Prince Philip, I have read so many different things about the princes walking behind the coffin. I've heard that it was government's decision, that it was the prince's decision, that it was Spencer's decision, that it was the royal family's decision. I've heard so many different things, but obviously, as Andrew Morton has written here, it was Prince Philip who sort of encouraged them. But I don't necessarily think that's what he means. I think Prince Philip was like, the boys were probably thinking, okay, should we do this, should we not? And they weren't sure. And then he was probably like, look, if I go with you, will you do it? As a sort of supporter. And again, it's just an example of how Prince Philip and the Queen were loving grandparents. And also, I think that perhaps only William should have walked behind the coffin and Harry shouldn't have. I think there should have been a decision that he shouldn't have, because he was only 12. And I think that people should have been, that the decision should have been made for him to say no. Because somebody should have had the foresight that he was too young. And that also there would have been this imagery that would have lasted, and has obviously lasted the test of time, of this small little boy. And Harry was not only 12, but he was small. Of this small little boy walking behind his mother's coffin. I mean, for God's sake, it's so terrible. And that has lived with him to this day. We can't stop hearing about it. The imagery is everywhere. And I think he could have done without it. And somebody needed to have stepped it in. And that probably should have been the Queen, and said, no, Harry stays behind. William goes. William is old enough. And, he can do it for his mum. He's emotionally stronger. And he'll have the support of everyone. And as the eldest sibling, he should have just represented the siblings, and his brother should have stayed, right? Because if you think about it, they have like coronations and things, and they're like, oh, little kids below the age of 4, below the age of 5, like can't attend. They had Prince Charles and Princess Anne. They didn't attend their mother's coronation, or I think Prince Charles did, but Princess Anne didn't because she was too young. So you think, hello, maybe Harry shouldn't have been there. Anyway. Those are my thoughts. On Saturday the 6th of September, the day of the funeral, the Queen and her family assembled outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. As the funeral cortege passed the royal family, Her Majesty bowed her head in a moment of obeisance, acknowledging Diana herself, but perhaps what she represented about the changing values of modern Britain. And I remember when the Queen bowed her head, and I think other members of the royal family also bowed their head. But can you imagine the Queen of England? People bow to her. She's bowing her head to Princess Diana. I mean, she was showing respect in the moment. And I think that it's unfair that it is not the mainstream narrative that the Queen loves Diana, loved her and was happy for her to marry Charles, was happy for Charles and Diana, didn't want them to divorce, and was moved by her death. And I think that it is unfair that narrative never really got out. So I think that her giving that nod to Diana was her last way of showing respect. As other members of the royal family also lowered their heads as a sign of respect, Princess Margaret remained upright and upstanding, looking as though she would rather be somewhere else. Oh, Princess Margaret, man. Princess Margaret, I've got nothing against you, but Princess Margaret is savage. Go and check out my first video. I talk about Princess Margaret's reaction to Princess Diana, the news that Princess Diana's dead. And there is a slight reference to it in the movie Queen. However, it doesn't go into detail, and Andrew Morton does go into detail. So check out the first video and Princess Margaret's reaction. It's so savage. And you'd think, and it also explains the reasons why, but you'd think, okay, if you dislike this person, okay, you think when you find out this young girl has just died so tragically, you think that it would hit you. And you would feel so, so sad. And then you'd think that if you see her body in front of you in a coffin, you think that there would be a part of you that would be extremely sad for her. But no, she stood steadfast in her feelings. She was all in her feelings. And, reacted as though she didn't care. And it's so savage. And it just makes you think, though, that somebody like that has been through a lot. Somebody like that, where there is so much tragedy, they would just and just react, like just not have a reaction, is because they've been through so much pain, so much trauma and heartache that they've hardened their emotions, and it's really, really sad, but there we are. Somewhat bizarrely, while the Queen and Margaret were waiting for the arrival of the cortege, Margaret had been nagging her sister about improving the lavatories at Kensington Palace. Oh my god. That is so savage. That is savage. She's talking about the toilets. It was a moment that symbolised the extent of the estrangement between Margaret and Diana, the two former royal neighbours. Wow. Paradoxically, it was the fact that the boys displayed the traditional royal virtues of stoicism and fortitude amid a sea of tears that lent the funeral such an emotional resonance. I mean, yeah, the fact that obviously the boys were so visible, it really, really hit people hard. They adhered impeccably to the maxim of Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone: you don't wear private grief on a public sleeve. Wow. I didn't know that was said by Countess Athlone, but wow. Prince Philip comforted his grandsons on that lengthy walk by quietly pointing out historic landmarks and explaining their background. That is so funny. Did any of you notice that? Because I didn't notice him talking. But he was talking along the way to his grandsons about historic landmarks. Now, I'm really glad that wasn't caught on camera, because if it was, can you imagine the criticism? Oh, look at Prince Philip, doesn't care, chatting away. But actually, he was trying to comfort his grandsons. And how amazing is that? I mean, there is this scene, I remember, where they're going underneath like a kind of underpass, and the cameras are going out of shot, and Prince Philip puts his hand around Prince Philip. Prince Philip puts his hand around Prince William, sorry. So either William or Harry. And it just shows that in the public, they are, they're doing their duty, they're doing their job, they're playing their role. They're not kissy, kissy, huggy, huggy, softy, softy, because they have to lead. They are public figures. They are a figurehead. They have to lead. They are leadership beyond politics. And they have to be stoic, and they have to be strong. They represent everyone. And they have to be steadfast and constant. And in private, they are kissy, kissy, huggy, huggy, because there's this grandfather who has this one moment that he knows the camera's not going to be there, and he puts his arm around his grandson. And how beautiful is that? Inside Westminster Abbey, an estimated worldwide audience of 2.5 billion watched as Diana's sisters Jane and Sarah each read a verse of poetry, and Tony Blair read a chapter from the Bible, while Elton John gave an emotional rendition of his hit song Candle in the Wind, which he dedicated to late Princess. Oh my god, do you remember that song, Candle in the Wind? Oh my god, it was beautiful at the time, but after, I just can't bear it. It was on the radio non-stop. I remember travelling around with my dad, going to the shops, and it was just on every radio station. Every radio station was talking about Princess Diana's death, and every radio station was just playing this song on loop. And I remember my mum bought the CD, I remember my sister bought the CD. I think you got a copy of it free in a magazine or something, or if you purchased it, the proceeds would go to charity, something like that. So people were purchasing it. I think my sister and my mum bought like 3 or 4 between them. I mean, it was ludicrous. It was Charles Spencer who publicly drew down the gauntlet to the royal family and the mass media at his funeral oration, implicitly rebuking the former for stripping the princess of her royal appellation. She needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic. And they were criticised for the distant way they raised their children. So let's break that down for a minute, because throwing down the gauntlet on the royal family. Now check out my video number 2, because I talk about this. Now I've heard him speak saying that, he didn't mean his speech to come across as though he was attacking the royal family, because he is a member of the aristocracy. He serves the Queen. He's an earl. So it's interesting that obviously that's what people took from it. He was obviously angry when he wrote his speech. He obviously was sad and grieved and wanted to do his justice to his sister. And then also rebuking the former for stripping the princess of her royal appellation. Now, saying she doesn't need a title to continue to generate her brand of magic. Now, as I understand it, in my first video, Andrew Morton talks about how during the divorce, Princess Diana was the one who gave up her HRH. So she was still Princess Diana, and I think she was still Princess of Wales. So I don't understand what he's talking about, not having a royal title. I mean, she did have the royal title. And criticising them for the distant way they raised their children. I mean, come on now. Okay, Earl Spencer, I've got no bone to pick with you, but you're an earl, you're a member of the aristocracy, your children probably go to boarding school, you went to boarding school. Let's not have an argument about how people raise their children. Okay, you are not the highest echelon of aristocracy levels, but you are an earl. Your family's been in aristocracy for about 700 years. The Queen and the royal family are the highest ends of aristocracy. And the job that they have to do, you should be able to understand and have some compassion. They're not able to go and pick up their children every day from school. It just isn't the reality. So you should have some compassion. He pledged to William and Harry that the Spencers, their blood family, would continue the imaginative way in which Princess Diana was steering her sons, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as she planned. He also ripped into the popular press, highlighting their seemingly permanent quest to bring her down. So that's interesting that he said, and I do remember this, that essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, that the Spencers are going to be there for Harry and William and ensure that they're raised the way that Princess Diana wanted them to be. Well, let's pause for a moment, because from what I've read, it didn't seem that he was really there that much during the last part of Princess Diana's life. And from what we hear Harry say, particularly in his book Spare, is that there wasn't really anyone around. So, it's not like he says, oh, the royal family, blah, 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 blah. Oh, but I had my Spencer family who were always there for me and raised me like my mum wanted me to be raised. And they supported me and they got me therapy and they took me to Thorpe Park and blah. You know what I mean? That doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm surprised. In his concluding words, praising his sister as the unique and complex, and in his concluding words, praising his sister as the unique, the complex, the extraordinary, and irreplaceable Diana, whose beauty, both internal and external, will never be extinguished from our minds, applause ripped from the crowd outside the open doors of Westminster Abbey. Those words were so iconic. Inside the building, after a moment of recognition, the congregation, including William and Harry, had been clapping. It was unclear, however, whether the applause was in acknowledgement of the Earl's assessment of his sister, the mass media, or the royal family. The Queen stared ahead, stone-faced, as did her husband, Prince Charles, was so incensed. The Queen stared ahead, stony-faced, as did her husband. Prince Charles was so incensed that later he had to be restrained from issuing a public statement. Well, that's interesting. I had no idea. He was so angry, he wanted to speak publicly. That's amazing. And also, it would have been a really bad idea because nobody had time for Prince Charles at that time. And nobody would have taken on board anything that he says. As Dickie Arbiter recalled, the mood inside the royal family was very angry about what he had said, and the courtiers were apoplectic, shell-shocked. Her Majesty believed that Earl Spencer should have focused more on Diana's evident Christian qualities, a point the Archbishop of Canterbury had made before the service. The opportunity had been missed, she felt. I mean, I understand what the Queen means, but no one would have cared if Earl Spencer was talking about Diana's Christian qualities. The speech needed to be punchy because Diana was punchy, and the Spencers allegedly were all punchy, so it needed to be punchy, and it now goes down in history. After the funeral and Princess Diana's burial at Althorpe, the royal family returned to Balmoral. The next day, exactly a week after the accident, Tony Blair and Sherry Blair flew to the Queen's Highland home for an abbreviated prime ministerial autumn weekend. During his private audience with her, Blair spoke about the possible lessons to be learned from Princess Diana's death. That's funny. It wasn't he like in his 40s and he was like prime minister for 5 minutes. I mean, the Queen's first prime minister was Winston Churchill. I really don't think she cares to take Tony Blair's advice about what we can learn from Princess Diana's death. He recollected that the sovereign was reflected, considering and adjusting. Sure. Before she headed off on her delayed Italian holiday, Princess Margaret sent, and we know Princess Margaret loved her luxurious holidays, Princess Margaret sent her sister a note of thanks for how kindly you arranged everybody's lives after the accident and made life tolerable for the two boys. Okay. There, always in command, was you, listening to everyone and deciding on all the issues. I just felt you were wonderful. Well, that's nice, and that probably should have been made public, to be honest. After such a bruising week, the monarch appreciated the loyalty and support of a person who knew her so intimately. Brought up not to show emotion in public, Margaret, like the Queen, found the wailing and keening hard to understand. In another private letter, this time a reply that the sovereign sent to one of her close aides, Lady Henriette Abel-Smith, Her Majesty referred to the negatives and positives that had emerged from the funeral week. In a typed portion, she wrote, Diana's death was indeed dreadfully sad, and she is a huge loss to the country. But the public reaction to her death and the service in the Abbey seem to have united people around the world in a rather inspiring way. William and Harry have been so brave, and I am very proud of them. Well, I think those are very sweet words by the Queen, and I think they were very, very, very insightful. She obviously knows her people and knows her public, and is able to change with the times. In a handwritten paragraph at the end, she added, I think your letters was one of the first I opened. Emotions still so mixed up, but we have all been through a very bad experience. See, those were the Queen's intimate thoughts. She obviously struggled with the emotions of it all. It was just so much. And she's at the head of it all, right? Even though the Queen had been on the throne for more than 45 years, following Diana's death, it felt as if the monarch, or rather the monarchy, was on probation. She had gone head to head with her people, and by and large the people had won. While the mantra from Buckingham Palace was that lessons had been learned, a sceptical nation watched warily and reserved judgment. It was recognised that the disconnect between sovereign and society during the tumultuous funeral week would take some healing, although the polls clearly showed that Britons didn't want a republic. They wanted to see a modernised monarchy, more in touch with a multicultural UK. An EPOS poll for the Mail on Sunday that was commissioned during the week of the funeral gave the Queen some comfort, as it showed that 45% of the public felt that Britain would be worse off without a monarchy. For a woman schooled in precedent and tradition, with the unspoken question, what would my father have done, always hanging in her ear, any reform would be sensible and incremental. She was also stubborn when under threat. In 1957, when Lord Alchecham argued for the abolition of the presentation of deputons at Buckingham Palace, for example, the sovereign delayed the decision for a year, so as not to give the radical peer the satisfaction of saying, I told you so. How sad! It would have been so lovely to see debutantes. Gosh. And Britain was changing. While the new Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair praised the Queen as the best of British at a lunch to celebrate her 50th wedding anniversary in November 1997, he was on this cusp of overseeing a remodelling of the political landscape with closer European integration, devolution of powers to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, an elected Mayor of London, and the London Assembly on the horizon, as well as closer integration to European laws and conventions. With a growing movement of Scottish devolution and the Queen's beloved Commonwealth of Nations something of a political afterthought, the nation was fundamentally evolving, and not in a way that necessarily enhanced the monarchy. Amid calls for a people's monarchy to mirror the work of the people's princess, the Queen gradually adjusted her public persona, often with the advice of pollsters, well-connected diplomats, and media mavens. Prince Philip was especially interested in the new monarchy website, www.royal.uk, while the inception of the Way Ahead group, which comprised senior members of the royal family and the advisors, was designed to give early warning of problems ahead and chart a safe course for the monarchy in the future. Although the Queen has said, I don't do stunts, meaning that she won't play up to the camera or the prevailing view, the media pack had become swollen with correspondents looking for signs of the Diana effect. Had Her Majesty truly learned the lessons from the princess's life and altered her tone and style accordingly? The omens seemed positive. When the sovereign visited a school, she now sat with the children rather than stood with the head teacher. I mean, I am of the view that Princess Diana did change the royal family and how they connected with the people and how relevant they became. At a drive-through McDonald's in Ellesmere Port in July 1998, she allowed herself to be photographed with excited staff, and on a 1999 visit to Craigdale housing estate in Glasgow, she joined pensioner Susan McCarran for tea and chocolate biscuits in her neat-as-pin home. During a tour of Malaysia in September 1998, the Queen signed a Manchester United football for supporters. Though she was not an ardent football fan, she was happy for others to relay a story of her reaction during a needle match between England and Argentina in 1998 World Cup. When England had a goal disallowed, she had thrown her arms up in the air in disgust at the decision and declared, in a parody of her personality, "One is not amused." Former Edinburgh Provost Eric Milligan, who watched the match on television with Her Majesty at the Palace of Holyrood House, recalled that she was so excited that she had to leave the room for the penalty shootout, which predictably England lost. There were other unexpected sightings of the new-look sovereign. In a nod to egalitarianism, she regularly took the train to and from King's Lynn in Norfolk when she stayed at Sandringham. Several commuters expressed their shocked delight at walking past her first-class carriage and seeing the Queen quietly looking out as her fellow travellers passed by. As a writer in the Sunday Telegraph observed, "We are not seeing a new Queen. What we are gradually noticing is the same Queen reflecting the changing society around her." In a further nod to Diana, the Union flag was now routinely raised over unoccupied royal residences. I didn't know that that was in a nod to Diana, but how interesting. I mean, it's just so clear the changes that she made, right? The bare flagpole, which had caused so much concern during the funeral week, was no more. The princess was very good at picking issues, a palace official reflected, and we have to learn from that. She was very good at keeping abreast of topics of public concern. That was one of her strengths and a lesson that could be learned. In December 1997, the royal yacht Britannia, the floating country home and safe haven on overseas visits, was decommissioned in Portsmouth after more than 45 years of service. Now that's interesting because that's in 1997 in December, and obviously Diana died in August, but in The Crown I think it's sort of portrayed like it's already done, right? There's already been an episode of the Britannia yacht being decommissioned, but yet we haven't got to Diana's death, so that's interesting. It's out of turn. Her Majesty was reluctant to say goodbye as the yacht held so many memories of happy times spent together as a family, particularly the annual cruise in the Western Isles that they would take during their summer holidays in Scotland. Before the formal service, the royal family took one last lingering look around the vessel. It was an emotional private farewell, the Queen seen dabbing away tears before retiring for lunch at the stateroom. Later, at the public ceremony on the quayside, the Queen and the Princess Royal both watched tearfully as the Royal Marine Band played the highly evocative Highland Cathedral during the final farewell. It was quickly pointed out by several media pundits that although they never shed a tear for the princess, they cried over a floating piece of metal. Oh, that's savage, isn't it? I mean, oh god, that is quite savage. And the Princess Royal is Princess Anne, so we're not talking about Princess Margaret here. But yeah, I guess that is savage that obviously publicly they did shed a tear. I don't know whether there was some footage or some photographs of the Queen being quite teary-eyed and sort of wiping away a tear in Princess Diana's when the coffin passed. I thought that that was the case, but if not, yeah, it is quite savage that obviously a couple months later they're crying about a yacht. But obviously the yacht, it's obviously more. It's been in the family longer, it's obviously very emotional, but at the same time it was probably a culmination of all the emotions that they've suffered so far, so it's not necessarily dealt with in isolation. Sometimes, you know, you've just had enough of all the stuff that you've gone through, and then this is the sort of pinnacle, isn't it? It's like another thing, another thing, another thing, and then you just sort of break down, so it might have been because of that. The yacht was then stripped of all its royal memorabilia, which were placed into temporary storage at Windsor, while Britannia sailed north and was settled into her permanent mooring at Leith Harbour in Scotland. I don't know if the Royal Britannia has been made into a museum or anything, but that obviously it should be, if not. Over at Kensington Palace, and what they should do is like the rooms and everything as the Queen had used them, because obviously the Queen's passed away now, right? You know, the Queen's gone now, so they should use the rooms as like as the Queen had used them, and her breakfast laid out like as it was, her newspapers like as she would read, you know, that sort of stuff. Over at Kensington Palace, a similar operation had been undertaken by the Spencer family. Following Diana's death, belongings fell into the hands of trophy hunters. Following Diana's death, everything in her apartment was taken away lest her precious belongings fell into the hands of trophy hunters or members of staff with an eye for the main chance. How terrible is that? And how is that allowed? How is that allowed? The carpets, silk wallpaper, plants, and even and even the light bulbs were removed. Light bulbs. Her butler, Paul Burrell, thought the exercise was excessive and complained that Diana's mother, Frances Shane Kidd, had even shredded the blotting paper on her daughter's desk. Wow. Wow. And it's also alarming what people would pay for, right? So obviously people take these things because they probably can earn money from them. So it's amazing what people will pay for. So just coming to the end of this chapter now. Within a matter of months, all traces of the princess had been removed from her former royal home. So that's the end of that particular chapter, which is on the royal family's reaction to Princess Diana's death. So I don't know who were these people emptying out her stuff. And also, we've seen a reference to Paul Burrell there. He's obviously done his own autobiography, which I might actually read. And he was accused, I don't know who by, but he was accused of basically taking, like stealing, as it were, Diana's stuff. And I think Harry has accused him in his book Spare of selling Diana's stuff for money. That is obviously denied by Paul Burrell, and there was a prosecution that was dropped against him before he got to give any evidence. So you just heard sort of the prosecution side, and then it was dropped. So he says that that's why he then released this book, because he was almost bankrupt and he didn't have his side of the story. I know that Harry sort of criticises him a lot in Spare. So he denies that he ever took Diana's stuff, but obviously this book is quite telling because it seems that he was a bit irate. He was saying, you know, this is a bit excessive, kind of taking everything off the room, you know, the light bulbs and the this and the this and the that. So I don't know who were the people who took all her things or took some of her things and who allowed that. But it obviously wasn't members of the royal family. It was obviously just Harry and William that had a little bit of her jewellery and her, you know, her valuables. But it seems really unfair that it all wasn't saved for William and Harry. You know, there should have been someone that gutted out the room, gutted out her apartment in Kensington Palace, and just put everything in storage for Harry and William when they were ready to go through it. It should have been their decision to go through her stuff, to get rid of whatever they wanted to go, to give away the stuff that they wanted to give away, or they might have wanted to do some charity stuff, or they might have wanted to do a museum. I mean, Kensington Palace is open for visitors, well, part of it anyway. And can you imagine, they could have had her room as a museum, or they could have, you know, I think her room's been renovated now to something completely different, like I don't even know, like a living room or an office or something. But her rooms could have been a museum with all her stuff, or, you know, they could have just put some of her stuff on display elsewhere in Kensington Palace, and they could have given her other stuff and auctioned it to charity or given stuff away. But it really should have been Harry and William's decision. You know, things like the maternity dresses she wore on the stairs of the hospital when she came out with William, or when she came out with Harry when they were just born. Like, where are those stuff? You know, those are things that perhaps Harry and William may have wanted. There's things that they may have wanted for their children. You know, other parts of her jewellery, or other you know, bags or shoes or whatever that they might have wanted for, you know, Charlotte and Lilibet. So it's sad, you know, I don't know the full extent. I mean, I don't think this book is clear, but it seems as though everything was gutted out, and so it is a shame if not all of it went to Harry and William. Anyway, guys, that's the end of that chapter. So thank you so much for staying with me on this journey. So I am going to be covering other parts of the book, because the book does cover the arrival of Meghan Markle. And it does cover the death of Prince Philip. So I will be touching upon these chapters. So please do press the subscribe button and press the notification button so that you are notified when there's another video. So thank you guys, and take care. Bye.